The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth of Redemption Gap. For 3 months, it had offered no reprieve, only a relentless, white-hot glare that bleached the sky and baked the very life from the land. The dust was a living thing, a fine, gritty powder that coated every surface, filled every lung, and settled in the deep lines etched around Thomas Miller's eyes. His ranch, once a testament to hard work and modest prosperity, was shrinking under the assault. The creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the grass in his pastures was the color of old bones. He'd lost 3 head of cattle last week alone, their bodies gaunt and hollowed by the drought. The land was a mirror of his own soul, barren, silent, and closed off. It had been 5 years since he'd buried Elara, 5 years since the light had been extinguished from his world, leaving him in a perpetual twilight of memory and duty. He remembered the day with a clarity that felt like a fresh wound, the doctor's helpless shrug, the hushed whispers of the women who came to help, the terrible, final stillness of her hand in his. He had made a vow at her graveside, a silent promise whispered into the unforgiving wind. He had loved once, with the entirety of his being. There was nothing left to give another. His heart was now as fallow as his fields, and he intended to keep it that way. He was a man of routine and discipline, respected in town for his unyielding fairness and the quiet strength that radiated from him like heat from a blacksmith's forge. He was Thomas Miller, the rancher, a man who kept his word, paid his debts, and asked for nothing. They called him steady. They called him strong. They didn't see the hollowing emptiness that came with the night, when the only sound was the wind rattling the window frames of his too-empty house. He worked from before sunrise until long after sunset, seeking an exhaustion so profound that it might, for a few blessed hours, silence the ghosts. It was on a Tuesday, the hottest day of a relentlessly hot week, that the stagecoach was due. It brought mail, supplies, and today, something new. A letter a month prior from a church aid society in the East had proposed a new arrangement, a sign of the desperate times. They called them brides for work. It was a delicate name for a harsh reality. Women left destitute by war, poverty, or circumstance, with no family to support them, were sent west. They were not brides in the true sense, but contracted housekeepers, cooks, and helpers. In exchange for their labor, they received room, board, and a small, agreed-upon wage. It was a formal, binding contract, meant to protect both parties. A roof over a woman's head in exchange for honest work. It seemed a sensible, if somber, solution. Thomas hadn't wanted any part of it. The thought of another woman's presence in Elara's home felt like a profanity. But his foreman, a grizzled old man named Silas, who had a wife and 4 children to feed, had been blunt. "You're working yourself to death. Thomas, the house is gathering dust. Your meals are whatever you can burn in a pan. And you look like a ghost. You need help. The ranch needs help." He had finally, reluctantly, agreed. He signed the papers sent by post, his signature a stark, black line of resignation. He requested someone sturdy, plain, and quiet. He didn't want conversation. He didn't want complications. He just wanted the work done. The society had replied, confirming a woman would be on the next stage. Her name, the letter stated, was Isabel. When the stagecoach, a lumbering beast caked in miles of dust, finally rattled to a stop in the center of town, a small crowd had gathered. News traveled fast in Redemption Gap. The arrival of the working brides was an event, a source of gossip and speculation. Thomas stood apart from the crowd, his hat pulled low, his arms crossed over his chest. He felt a familiar tightening in his gut, a mix of apprehension and regret. The door creaked open. The first woman to emerge was thin and pale, with wide, frightened eyes. She was followed by another, a plain-faced girl who looked barely 16. They clutched their small bundles and were quickly claimed by the blacksmith and the general store owner, their new employers. Then, a third figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dark interior of the coach. She paused for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the brutal sunlight. The contract had said nothing of her appearance. Isabel was not plain. She was tall for a woman, with a full, womanly figure that the simple, travel-worn dress could not conceal. Her hair was the color of midnight, pulled back in a severe knot, but loose tendrils escaped, framing a face that was both beautiful and weary. Her skin was olive, a shade darker than the fair-skinned women of the town, and her mouth was full, set in a line that was neither a smile nor a frown, but it was her eyes that held him, dark, almond-shaped, and filled with 1,000 complexities he could not begin to unravel, a deep, swirling mix of exhaustion, defiance, and a sliver of something that looked like desperate hope. She descended the steps with a grace that seemed out of place amidst the dust and grime. She held no bundle, only a small, worn satchel. She scanned the faces in the crowd, her gaze passing over the curious, the judgmental, and the pitying, until it landed on him. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He was the one, Rancher Thomas Miller, her employer. A hush fell over the onlookers. The town sheriff, a portly man named Jebediah, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, you must be the one for the Miller Ranch." Isabel's gaze did not leave Thomas's face. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the unnatural silence with perfect, chilling clarity. It was low, slightly husky, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Let's make it quick tonight." The words hung in the dry, stagnant air. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Women flushed and turned away, whispering behind their hands. Men shifted their weight, some with leers, others with looks of disbelief. The sheriff's jaw went slack. The phrase, so bald and transactional, could only mean one thing. It was the language of a saloon girl, of a woman who knew what a man might expect in a private arrangement, regardless of what was written on paper. Thomas froze. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a cold, rising fury. This was what the church society sent. This woman, with her bold, shameful words, spoken in broad daylight for the whole town to hear. She had, in a single sentence, sullied his name and announced herself as a source of trouble more potent than a barrel of gunpowder. He felt the weight of every stare. The heat of the town's judgment now fixed squarely on him. He had brought this disgrace upon himself. His first instinct was to turn his back, to tell the sheriff to put her on the next stage out. Destination be damned. He was a man of honor. He would not have this kind of woman on his land. He took a half-step back, his hands clenching into fists. But then, he made the mistake of looking at her eyes again. For a fleeting second, past the hard, protective shell, he saw it. A flicker of raw vulnerability, a desperate, pleading light in their depths that contradicted the coldness of her words. And in that light, he saw a ghost. He saw the same deep, soulful darkness that had lived in Alara's eyes. It wasn't the shape or the color, but the essence, a quiet strength that hid a tender heart. The memory struck him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath and rooting him to the spot. Ilara. He didn't believe for a second her words were an innocent misunderstanding. He believed she was exactly the kind of woman she presented herself to be, damaged, desperate, and dangerous to a man's peace. But that glimpse of his late wife in a stranger's eyes was a crack in his resolve. He couldn't send her away. Not yet. Without a word, he turned and strode toward his wagon. His silence was more damning than any shout. He grabbed her small satchel from the dirt where she'd let it fall and tossed it into the back. "Get in!" he growled, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Isabel followed, her back ramrod straight, her face an unreadable mask. She climbed onto the wagon seat, keeping a careful distance between them. The ride back to the ranch was a long, suffocating ordeal. The silence was broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses. The sun beat down. The dust rose in choking clouds. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set like granite. He could feel her presence beside him, a warmth, a scent of lavender and travel dust that felt alien and intrusive. He was acutely aware of every rustle of her dress, every quiet breath she took. He hated it. He hated her for bringing this complication into his ordered, empty life. He hated himself for allowing it. When they finally arrived at the ranch, the place looked even more desolate than usual. The main house, a sturdy 2-story structure he had built with his own hands for Ilara, seemed to sag with a weary loneliness. The porch swing was still. The flower beds Ilara had so lovingly tended were now just patches of scorched earth. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the barn. "This is it," he said, his tone flat. He got down and pointed to a small, windowless room attached to the tack shed. It was clean and dry, but it was meant for storing saddles and grain, not for housing a person. "You'll stay there. There's a cot and a basin. You will take your meals in the cookhouse after I've eaten. You are not to enter the main house unless I expressly ask you to. Your work begins at sunrise. Silas will give you your duties." It was a cold, brutal dismissal. He was drawing a line, not in the sand, but in solid rock. She was an employee, a hand, less, even. She was an occupant of the outbuilding, a ghost he would not acknowledge. Isabel simply nodded, her expression unchanging. She slid down from the wagon, took her satchel, and walked to the designated room without a word of protest or complaint. She did not look back. The first week was a silent war. Thomas avoided her completely, speaking only through Silas, but he was aware of her. He couldn't help it. The ranch, his sanctuary of solitude, was now occupied territory. He'd see her from a distance, a flash of her dark dress as she beat rugs behind the house, or her silhouette bent over the laundry tub. The work was hard, far harder than what a typical housekeeper might expect. The drought meant every task was a struggle. Water had to be hauled from the deep well, the only one on the property that hadn't yet run dry. The fine dust got into everything, requiring constant, back-breaking cleaning. Yet, she never faltered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. The first thing he noticed was the food. For 5 years, he had subsisted on burned bacon, dry biscuits, and coffee thick enough to use as tar. One evening, when he entered the small cookhouse, a plate was waiting for him on the table. It was a simple stew of rabbit and root vegetables, but it was rich and savory. The biscuits beside it were light and fluffy, and there was a small jar of wild berry preserves he hadn't seen in years. He ate every bite, a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the food. He told himself it was just part of her job. Then came the laundry. His work shirts, usually stiff with dirt and sweat, came back clean, mended, and smelling of sun and soap, not the harsh lie he was used to. He found a button sewn back on his favorite jacket, the thread a perfect match. Small things, insignificant things, but they were signs of a care and attention to detail that went beyond the cold letter of their contract. The most profound change came with the horses. His best mare, Daisy, had a nasty gash on her leg from a piece of barbed wire. It was festering in the heat, and Thomas was preparing to treat it with a hot iron and whiskey, a brutal but effective remedy. He was in the barn when Isabel appeared at the doorway. "Allow me," she said, her voice soft. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him since that first day. He grunted, ready to refuse, but she was already moving past him. She knelt by the nervous mare, murmuring to it in a low, soothing tone. The horse, which had been skittish and wild-eyed, visibly calmed under her touch. From a pouch she had brought with her, she took out a wad of crushed leaves and what looked like moss. She cleaned the wound with a gentle, practiced hand, her fingers surprisingly deft, and then applied the poultice, binding it with a clean strip of cloth. "Comfrey and yarrow," she explained, her eyes on her work. "It will draw out the infection and help the skin to mend without a thick scar." Thomas stood by, watching in stunned silence. He watched her hands, strong and capable, yet gentle. He watched the way the mare leaned into her touch, trusting her completely. He had expected a woman of trouble and vice. He was finding a woman of quiet competence and hidden knowledge. The discovery was unsettling. It didn't fit the neat, ugly box he had put her in. He remained hard. He never thanked her. He never acknowledged the improved meals or the mended clothes. He kept the wall between them high and thick. When he passed her on the property, his gaze was cold, his nod curt. He was the rancher. He was a man who had sworn off feeling. But at night, when the work was done and the house was silent, he would find himself looking out the window toward the tack shed. He would see the faint flicker of a single candle through a crack in the door, a tiny pinprick of light in the vast, lonely darkness of his ranch, and he would feel a stir of something he refused to name. A crack was forming in the dry, barren ground of his heart, and he knew, with a certainty that both terrified and intrigued him, that it was this silent, complicated woman who was the cause, the woman who had arrived with a scandalous proposal, but who was now, through her quiet, persistent care, beginning to sow seeds in a place he had long thought dead. The oppressive heat of the day bled into stifling, breathless nights. The moon, when it appeared, was a pale, sickly thing, offering no coolness, only a stark, silver light that threw the parched landscape into ghostly relief. It was on these nights that Thomas's carefully constructed solitude was most vulnerable. He would lie in his bed, the sheets coarse against his skin, his mind refusing the solace of sleep. And then it would begin. A sound, faint at first, drifting from the direction of the tack shed. It was a melody, a humming so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the chirping of the crickets. But it was human. It was Isabel. She would sing, her voice a low, melancholic thread of sound weaving through the darkness. The songs were unfamiliar, laced with a sorrow that spoke of distant lands and deep losses. They were not for him, or for anyone. They were for herself, a private comfort in a lonely place. But they found him. They slipped through the cracks in his windows and the walls of his heart. The sound filled the empty spaces in the house, the spaces that had once echoed with Alara's laughter and now held only a suffocating silence. He would turn onto his side, pressing his face into the pillow, trying to block it out. But the melody persisted. It was a sound of life, of feeling. In a world he had deliberately drained of both, it made his teeth ache. It made the ghost of Alara whisper in his ear. It made him feel a profound, infuriating loneliness he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in 5 years. He would lie awake for hours, listening, hating the sound and hating the woman who made it, until the first gray light of dawn finally silenced her song and released him to the familiar anesthesia of work. The drought worsened, the fences on the far western pasture, bordering unforgiving government land, were in disrepair. Cattle, mad with thirst, could break through and wander for miles, lost to the buzzards and the heat. It was a 3-hour ride, a full day's work under a sun that felt like a physical weight. He set out at dawn, leaving Silas in charge of the main ranch. He told himself the distance was good. It would put miles between him and the sound of that nightly humming. He worked with a grim, rhythmic fury. He pulled the old posts, dug new holes in the rock-hard soil, and stretched the sharp, unforgiving wire. Sweat poured from him, stinging his eyes and soaking his shirt. The sun climbed to its zenith, a white-hot eye in a cloudless sky. He ignored the gnawing in his gut, the lightheadedness that came from dehydration. He had one last post to set. He heaved it into place, and as he drove the mallet down, his foot slipped on a patch of loose shale. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a clumsy, awkward twist. But the sound, a sickening pop from his ankle, was immediate and absolute. A wave of white-hot pain shot up his leg, so intense it made him gasp. He collapsed to the ground, the dust rising around him. He tried to stand, but the slightest pressure sent a fresh, nauseating bolt of agony through him. He looked at his ankle. It was already beginning to swell, a grotesque purple bulge straining against his boot. He was miles from home, with no water left in his canteen and a leg that was utterly useless. For the first time in years, a sliver of genuine fear pierced his stoic reserve. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, the sun cooking the very air he breathed. The world shimmered and warped at the edges of his vision. He passed into a state of hazy semi-consciousness, the pain a dull, constant throb. He thought of Alara. He thought of how foolish he was, pushing himself like this. A sound pulled him back, the soft, rhythmic plodding of a single horse. He lifted his head, his vision swimming. A figure on horseback was coming over the rise, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. It was Isabel. She rode his spare mare, Clementine, as if she'd been born in a saddle. She carried a full canteen and a wet cloth. She must have noted his absence at midday, known something was wrong. No one had told her to. She had simply noticed. The thought was as unsettling as the pain in his leg. She didn't speak when she reached him. Her dark eyes took in the situation in a single, sweeping glance. His position on the ground, the swollen ankle, the discarded mallet. Her face was a mask of calm competence. She dismounted, soaked the cloth from the canteen, and gently wiped the dust and sweat from his face. The touch was cool, a shocking relief. "Can you ride?" she asked, her voice low and even. "I can manage," he gritted out, though he knew it was a lie. Getting him onto the horse was an agonizing ordeal. Every movement was fire. She was surprisingly strong, taking his weight without staggering, her shoulder firm under his arm. He had to swallow his pride, a bitter pill, and let her help him. His body pressed against hers for a fleeting, mortifying moment. He smelled the sun on her skin, the clean scent of soap in her hair. It was an intimacy he had not chosen, and it sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with his injury. The ride back was a slow, torturous journey through a landscape of throbbing pain. She led the horse, her back to him, a steady, silent presence. When they finally reached the ranch house, she didn't take him to his room. She led him straight into the main house, into the kitchen, and helped him into a chair. She was breaking his most sacred rule, but he was in too much pain to protest. She worked with a quiet efficiency that was both unnerving and deeply impressive. She slit his boot with a knife, peeling it away from the horribly swollen flesh. A low hiss of breath escaped her lips, the only sign of emotion she showed. She sent a wide-eyed Silas for cold water from the well and a bottle of whiskey from the pantry. For the next hour, she tended to him. Her hands, which he had only seen gripping a broom or a scrubbing brush, were now impossibly gentle as she cleaned the dirt from his skin and wrapped his ankle in cold, wet rags. He watched her, his head swimming from the pain and the 2 large glasses of whiskey he'd choked down. He watched the way her dark hair fell across her cheek as she bent over his leg. He watched the focused, serious set of her mouth. Her touch was professional, impersonal, yet it felt like a brand on his skin. This was a woman's touch, a soft, caring touch. His body, starved of such a thing for 5 long years, reacted with a will of its own, a deep, cellular tremor of awareness that made him feel profoundly uneasy. He was supposed to be a fortress. She was inside the walls. That night, the fever came. The pain and the heat conspired against him, dragging him into a delirious, sweat-soaked nightmare. The world became a shifting fog of memory and sensation. He was back at the fence line, the sun beating down. He was in this kitchen, Ilara humming as she baked bread. Then the image would change, and it was Isabel's face leaning over him, her dark eyes filled with a concern he couldn't comprehend. The 2 women blurred, their faces merging in his fevered mind. "Ilara," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. He reached out a hand, searching for a phantom. "Ilara, the water. It's so hot." He didn't see the look on Isabel's face as she sat by his chair, replacing the compress on his forehead. He didn't see the way her expression shuddered, the light in her eyes dimming as if a candle had been snuffed out. He didn't see her hand, which had been about to touch his shoulder, pull back as if burned. He was lost in the past, and in his delirium, he had confirmed her deepest fear. She was, and would always be, a shadow in another woman's home. She heard the name, and it was a final, locking turn of a key in a door she hadn't even realized she'd been hoping to open. He was confined to the house for 3 days. Isabel ran the household with an unspoken authority, her silence a constant, unnerving presence. She cooked for him, brought him water, and changed the wrappings on his ankle, all without meeting his eyes. The fortress had been breached, but now a new wall had been erected between them, one of her own making. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He was weak, but his mind was clear. The awkwardness was a thick, tangible thing in the room. He felt a grudging gratitude he didn't know how to express. "The ankle is better," he said gruffly, by way of thanks. She simply nodded, gathered his empty plate, and left the room. Later that week, seeking a book in the rarely used parlor, Isabel was dusting the tall, mahogany bookshelf. A small, carved wooden box was tucked away on the highest shelf, behind a set of leather-bound encyclopedias. Thinking it was just another item to be cleaned, she took it down. It wasn't locked. Inside, tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a stack of letters. The handwriting was bold and masculine. His, Thomas's. They were addressed to "My dearest Alara." She knew she shouldn't. It was an unforgivable invasion of his privacy. But her hand moved as if of its own accord. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. "My dearest Alara," it began. "The days I spend away from you are a kind of drought for the soul. I count the hours until I can see your face again, the only rain that can make my world green." She read on, her heart constricting in her chest. The letters were filled with a passion and a tenderness she couldn't have imagined from the hard, silent man she knew. He wrote of his dreams for the ranch, for their future. He described the beauty of a sunset, comparing the colors to her hair. He wrote poetry, clumsy but heartfelt, about the light in her eyes. This was not the rancher Thomas Miller, a man of iron and discipline. This was a man who had loved with every fiber of his being, a man who had bared his soul on paper. She sank to the floor, the letters spread in her lap, and she wept. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking, tears tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She cried for the man who had lost this beautiful love. She cried for the woman, Alara, who was so fiercely adored. And she cried for herself, for the stark, painful realization of her own place in this story. She was a hired hand, a temporary fixture in the home of a man whose heart was a shrine to a dead woman. The name he had called in his fever was not just a name. It was the key to the entirety of his being, and she was on the outside. A week later, the sky, which had been a merciless, empty blue for months, began to bruise with dark, ominous clouds. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of rain. That night, the storm broke. It was a true western gully washer. Rain came down in solid, driving sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky itself splitting apart, and lightning lit the world in stark, terrifying flashes. Isabel was in her small room in the tack shed. With every clap of thunder, she flinched, pulling her thin blanket tighter. She had always been afraid of storms. The roof of the old shed, never meant for this kind of deluge, began to leak. First a drip, then another, until a steady, cold stream of water was pouring onto her cot. She moved, huddling in a corner, but the room was small, and the water was finding new ways in. Another crash of thunder, louder this time, rattled the very foundations of the shed. It was too much. Driven by a primal fear that overrode all rules and all pride, she gathered her blanket, threw open the door, and ran through the torrential, muddy downpour to the main house. She didn't knock. She burst through the kitchen door, soaked and shivering, her hair plastered to her face. Thomas was sitting at the table, a single lamp lit, a book open before him. He looked up, his expression startled. "The roof!" she stammered, her teeth chattering. "It's leaking! The thunder!" He could see the genuine terror in her eyes. The hard lines of his face softened for a fraction of a second. This wasn't a defiance of his rules. This was a desperate plea for shelter. He remembered Alara, how she too had hated the thunder, how she would press her face into his chest until the worst of it passed. He gave a slow nod. "You can stay here, on the floor by the hearth. It's warm there." He didn't send her away. He let her stay. It was a bigger concession than he could ever have imagined making. She laid her blanket on the braided rug before the cold fireplace and huddled down, trying to stop her trembling. He went back to his book, but he wasn't reading. He was listening to the storm and to the sound of her breathing. An hour passed. The storm raged on. A particularly violent clap of thunder, directly overhead, made her cry out, a small, choked sound. She sat bolt upright. In the flickering lamplight, her eyes found his across the room. They were wide, dark pools of fear and vulnerability. He saw no artifice, no calculation. He only saw a woman who was terrified and alone. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But for a long, silent moment, their gazes held, in the heart of the storm, in the dead of night. Something shifted between them. A silent acknowledgement, a shared moment of humanity that transcended their strange, formal arrangement. But the world outside the ranch was not silent. Thomas's trip into Redemption Gap the following Saturday was a trial. The rumors, sparked by Isabel's first words, had taken root and grown into ugly, thorny weeds. As he walked toward the general store, he felt the change, the whispers that followed him, the women who gathered their skirts and turned their heads, the men who nudged each other, their faces wearing smug, knowing grins. The story had written itself in the town's small, vicious imagination. The lonely, grieving rancher had bought himself a woman under the guise of hiring a housekeeper. Isabel, who had come with him to purchase thread, felt it even more keenly. She walked a few paces behind him, her head held high, but she could feel the stares like physical blows. They were not looking at a housekeeper. They were looking at a whore. As she was leaving the mercantile, a man stumbled out of the saloon. It was Clem, a local layabout known for his mean streak when in his cups. He blocked her path, a drunken leer on his face. "Well now," he slurred, his voice loud enough for everyone in the street to hear. "If it ain't the rancher's quick woman, tell me, girlie, is he paying you enough? Or do you offer a discount for a man who ain't so picky?" Isabel froze, her face draining of color. She tried to step around him, but he blocked her again. "What's the matter? Too good for the likes of me? I hear you made your offer right in the street. I'm just taking you up on it." Thomas had just come out of the blacksmith's shop. He saw the scene in an instant. Clem backing Isabel against the wall, the circle of leering and curious onlookers, the humiliation burning on Isabel's face. Something inside him, a cold, tightly coiled rage he hadn't felt in years, snapped. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He crossed the dusty street in 4 long strides. Clem turned at his approach, a stupid, drunken grin on his face. "Miller, just talking business with your new—" Clem never finished the sentence. Thomas's fist connected with his jaw with a sickening crack of bone. It was not a brawler's punch. It was a single, precise, devastating strike, delivered with all the weight of his anger and frustration. Clem's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled into the dust, unconscious. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thomas stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, his knuckles scraped and bloody. His face was a mask of cold fury. The image of the quiet, stoic, unshakable rancher Miller had just been shattered in the middle of the town square. He had broken his own code. He had broken his 5 years of dispassionate calm. He looked at the shocked faces around him, his gaze daring any of them to say a word. Then, his eyes found Isabel's. He saw not gratitude, but a deep, profound sadness. He had defended her honor, but in doing so, he had only confirmed the town's sordid story. He had publicly claimed her as his to protect, and in their world, there was only one reason a man would fight for a woman like that. The ride back to the ranch was a long, punishing silence. The punch had settled nothing, if anything. It had stirred the dust of speculation into a choking cloud that now followed them home. Thomas could feel Isabel's gaze on him, but he refused to meet it. He had acted on pure, unthinking impulse, and the shame of it sat hot and heavy in his gut. He had lost control. He, Thomas Miller, a man whose entire existence was built on the foundation of unshakable control, had thrown a punch in the middle of town over a woman who was, by contract, nothing more than his housekeeper. He had given the gossips exactly what they wanted, a story. When they arrived, he pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to her, his face a grim mask. "You are not to go back into town," he said, his voice low and hard, each word a chip of ice. "Not for any reason. If supplies are needed, you will give a list to Silas. Is that understood?" It was not a request. It was an order, a command from an employer to his subordinate. But it was also something more. It was the act of a man trying to lock a cage after the bird had already been seen. He was trying to protect her. Yes, but he was also trying to protect himself. He was trying to shove the complication she represented back into the box he had designated for it. The ranch, his property, his domain, out of sight of the prying world. He expected compliance. He expected a nod, perhaps even a quiet word of thanks for defending her. He did not expect the flash of fire in her dark eyes. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held a core of steel. "That is not understood." Thomas stared at her, taken aback. "What did you say?" "I have done nothing to be ashamed of," she said, her chin lifting. "I will not be hidden away like a guilty secret. I will not be your prisoner." "This is not a prison. It's for your own good," he retorted, his voice rising with frustration. "Did you not hear that man? Did you not see the way they look at you, at us?" "I have been looked at before," she replied, a deep, ancient weariness in her tone that made her seem far older than her years. "A woman alone learns to bear the weight of looks. Hiding from them gives them power. I will not." His anger, born of shame and a terrifying, protective instinct he refused to name, boiled over. "You will do as I say. You are on my land, under my roof. You will obey my rules, or you will find yourself on the next stagecoach out of here. Contract be damned." He saw her flinch, the verbal blow landing with more force than Clem's fist ever could. Her face went pale. The threat was real. He had the power to cast her out, to leave her with nothing, at the mercy of a world that had already proven its cruelty. For a moment, he thought she would break, that she would finally yield. Instead, she simply looked at him, her eyes holding a deep, sorrowful disappointment. "Then you will do what you must, Mr. Miller," she said softly. She slid down from the wagon seat and walked to her small room in the tack shed, her back straight, leaving him sitting alone in the crushing silence, the victor of a battle that made him feel utterly defeated. He was sure he had won. The threat of dismissal was the final card, and he had played it. He expected her to remain on the ranch, sullen and resentful, perhaps, but obedient. He was wrong. 2 days later, Silas found him by the well, his face troubled. "Thomas, I thought you should know. Isabel, she's been walking into town every afternoon. After her main chores are done, she's been working at the bakery." Thomas's blood ran cold. "What?" "Seems Martha Henderson's boy came down with the measles. She needed help with the kneading and the ovens," Isabel offered. "Been there the last 2 days." Open defiance. She had looked him in the eye, heard his threat, and walked right past it. He stormed toward the house, his mind a thundercloud of fury. He would confront her. He would fire her. He would throw her meager belongings into the wagon and drive her to the stagecoach office himself. He would erase her from his life. He found her in the laundry yard, her arms elbow-deep in a tub of soapy water, her back to him. "Silas tells me you've been going into town," he said, his voice tight. She didn't turn around. "Yes." "You've been working at the bakery." "Yes, Mrs. Henderson pays a fair wage." "I gave you an order. Isabel—" At that, she finally turned, wiping her wet hands on her apron. Her face was calm, resolute. "You did, and I have a debt to pay. My sister, she has children to feed. The money I earn here is promised to her. The extra I earn at the bakery will help see them through the winter. My duty to her is older than my contract with you. I will not abandon it because of ugly words from a drunkard." Her quiet, simple dignity disarmed him completely. He had come expecting a fight, a shouting match. He was met with a woman not of rebellion, but of profound, unshakable responsibility. His anger, so hot and righteous a moment before, felt petty and childish. He saw his own selfishness laid bare. He wanted to hide her away to quiet the noise in his own head, while she was quietly fighting to keep a family from starving miles away. He stood there, speechless, the angry words dying in his throat. He had no response. He was the master of the ranch, a man whose word was law, and he had been rendered powerless by a woman's sense of duty. He turned without another word and walked away, the scent of laundry soap and quiet defiance following him. He did not fire her. The threat, now that he knew her reasons, tasted like ash in his mouth. But a cold, tense distance settled between them. They moved around each other like two planets in a hostile orbit, bound by forces they couldn't control but never touching. He was gruff and remote. She was polite, efficient, and impenetrable. She continued to work at the bakery in the afternoons, and he continued to pretend he didn't know. Isabel, for her part, tried to rebuild the wall around her own heart. She had seen the letters. She had heard the name he called in his fever. She knew this man was a locked room, and she did not have the key. Her feelings, a confusing, dangerous mix of gratitude for his protection, admiration for his hidden depths, and a tender ache she dared not examine too closely, were a liability. She was a temporary solution to a practical problem. A bride for work, a body sent to fill a space. She reminded herself of this every morning when she woke up on the hard cot, and every night when she blew out her candle in the lonely darkness. She had to keep her distance. Her survival depended on it. One evening, he saw her sitting on the steps of the tack shed, a piece of embroidery in her hands. She was mending one of her own thin shawls, her fingers moving with a quick, delicate grace. He had seen that same quiet focus when she'd tended to his horse, when she'd wrapped his ankle. It was a part of who she was. He found himself watching her from the shadows of the porch, a silent observer. He should go inside. He should turn away, but he couldn't. That night, the first chill of autumn was in the air. The relentless heat had finally broken, but it had been replaced by a dry, cold wind that rattled the loose boards of the barn and whispered of the coming winter. Thomas lay in his bed, the house silent around him. He thought of her, out there in the tack shed, with only a thin blanket against the cold. The room had no insulation, no stove. It was no better than sleeping in the open. He told himself it wasn't his concern. Their arrangement was clear. But the image of her shivering in the dark, her shoulders huddled against the wind, lodged itself in his mind. He saw her face, her quiet strength, her infuriating defiance, her surprising gentleness. He thought of the savory meals, the mended shirts, the calm way she had faced down his rage. With a groan of self-disgust, he threw back his own covers. He went to the large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, the one where Alara's things were kept. He paused, his hand hovering over the lid. Opening it felt like a betrayal, but he did it. The scent of dried lavender, faint after 5 years, rose to meet him. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket, one Elara had woven herself. It was warm and soft. He carried it across the yard, the wind whipping at his nightshirt. The moon was a sliver, casting long, dancing shadows. He reached the door to her room and stopped. He could hear the sound of the wind finding its way through the cracks in the walls. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door a crack, just enough to see inside. She was curled on the cot in a tight ball, her own thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her breathing shallow. She was asleep, but it was the restless sleep of someone fighting the cold. He could see her shiver, even in the deep shadows. Quietly, he pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room was bare and cold. In that moment, his anger at her, his frustration, all of it evaporated, replaced by a raw, powerful pang of something that felt dangerously like compassion. He gently unfolded the heavy wool blanket and draped it over her sleeping form. He tucked it in around her shoulders, his fingers brushing against her hair for a brief, electric moment. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, and settled deeper under the warmth. He backed out of the room as silently as he had entered, closing the door behind him. He stood in the yard for a long time, the cold wind doing nothing to cool the turmoil inside him. He had crossed a line. It wasn't the act itself, but the meaning behind it. It was an admission, an acknowledgement of her as a person, a woman, deserving of warmth and comfort. It was a gesture of care, and care was a feeling he had sworn he would never have again. The weeks that followed were the death knell of the season, the meager corn crop, stunted by the drought, withered on the stalk. The cattle grew thinner. The land simply gave up, surrendering to the long, hard reality of a failed harvest. It was a financial blow that would take years to recover from. For Thomas, it felt like a personal failure, another loss in a life defined by it. The barren fields were a perfect reflection of his own empty, fruitless existence. One night, after a long day of calculating his losses, the despair was too much to bear. The silence of the house pressed in on him, a physical weight. The ghosts were louder than ever. He went to the pantry, to a high shelf at the back, and took down a dusty bottle of whiskey. He hadn't touched a drop since the night Elara died. He sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a small circle of golden light in the overwhelming darkness. He poured a glass. The first swallow was fire, a welcome, obliterating burn. He poured another. He drank not for pleasure, but for numbness, seeking the quiet, empty place where memory and feeling could not reach him. Isabel saw the light in the kitchen from her window. It was late. It was not his habit to be up at this hour. A small knot of concern tightened in her stomach. She had made a pot of thin broth earlier, thinking he looked worn down. Hesitantly, she ladled some into a bowl. It was a peace offering, a gesture of truce in their silent war. She carried it across the yard, the bowl warm in her hands. She pushed open the kitchen door without knocking. "Mr. Miller, I brought you some." She stopped. The sight before her silenced her. He was sitting at the table, his back to her, the half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. He didn't look up. The slump of his shoulders spoke of a defeat so profound it made her own heart ache in sympathy. This was not the hard, controlled rancher. This was a man drowning. "Mr. Miller," she said again, her voice softer this time. He turned his head slowly. His eyes, when they met hers, were clouded with pain and alcohol. The hard edges of his face were softened, blurred by drink, revealing the raw grief that lay beneath. "Go away, Isabel," he slurred, his voice thick. She didn't move. She placed the bowl of soup on the far end of the table. "You should eat something." "I don't want it." He looked away, staring into the flickering flame of the lamp. "I don't want anything." She stood there, a silent witness to his unraveling. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. with 5 years of his grief and 2 months of their shared, tense existence. He looked so utterly alone, so broken. Her resolve to keep her distance crumbled. She took a step closer, and then another. She was standing beside his chair now, close enough to see the silver streaks in his dark hair, to smell the whiskey on his breath. He looked up at her, his eyes searching her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Why are you still here?" he whispered, his voice raw. "I'm a bitter, empty man. This place, this land is cursed. Why didn't you leave?" Her own carefully constructed walls began to fall. She saw past the anger, past the coldness, to the wounded man beneath, and she saw herself, her own loneliness, her own quiet desperation, reflected in his eyes. They were two broken people, trapped in a house of ghosts. All the rejection, all the pain of being kept at arm's length, of being nothing more than a replacement for a memory, rose up in her. Her voice, when she spoke, was a choked whisper, filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. "Let's make it quick tonight." The words were the same ones she had spoken on that first hot afternoon, but the meaning was transformed. It was no longer a cold, transactional statement. It was a plea, a cry of despair. It meant, "Let this charade be over. Let this unbearable distance between us end. If I am nothing more to you than a convenience, a body to ease your loneliness, then let it be so. Let's have the honesty of that. At least, let's make the hurt quick, instead of this slow, agonizing death of 1,000 cuts." He stared at her, the fog of the whiskey momentarily clearing. He heard the deep, shattering pain beneath the words. He saw the tears glistening in her eyes. He saw her final, desperate surrender, and something inside him, something that had been frozen solid for 5 years, cracked. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements unsteady. He was standing before her now, so close their bodies were almost touching. He reached out a hand, not to grab, but to gently cup her face. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped and traced the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, reverent, and it sent a tremor through her entire body. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he wasn't seeing the ghost of his wife. He was seeing her, Isabel. He was seeing her strength, her defiance, her quiet compassion. He was seeing all the pieces of her that had slowly, inexorably, worked their way into the barren soil of his soul. "No," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was more than desire. It was a profound, aching recognition. "Nothing with you is quick, Isabel." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of drunken lust. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of two lonely souls finally touching. It was hesitant at first, then deepened with a raw, searching hunger. It was filled with all the unspoken words, all the silent observations, all the shared pain of the past months. Her hands came up to grip his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against him. A desperate, protective embrace. They clung to each other in the dim, flickering lamplight. Two castaways finding shore in one another. It was not about forgetting the past or escaping the pain. It was about finding a single and shared moment of warmth in the middle of a long, cold winter. It was a silent, mutual admission that the loneliness had become too much to bear. And in the quiet, desperate darkness of the ranch house kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of what was lost, they crossed a line from which there would be no return, seeking not passion, but the simple, profound comfort of another human being who understood. The first light of dawn was a merciless observer. It crept into the kitchen, pale and gray, illuminating the scene with a cold, unforgiving clarity. The nearly empty whiskey bottle, 2 glasses, a single chair pulled slightly askew from the table. It touched upon the cold, greasy film on the surface of the untouched bowl of broth. The intimacy of the night, born of shadow and whiskey and desperation, could not survive the harsh light of day. Isabel awoke in his bed. The sheets smelled of him, a scent of earth, leather, and soap. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, a fragile warmth bloomed in her chest. She had not been sent back to the tax shed. She was here, in the heart of the house, in the heart of his solitude. She turned, expecting to find him beside her, expecting, perhaps, a word, a look, some acknowledgement of the chasm they had crossed. The other side of the bed was empty. The pillow was cold. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air seeped into her bones. She sat up, pulling the heavy quilt around her shoulders. The house was unnaturally quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the tense, deliberate silence of avoidance. She dressed quickly in the clothes she had left in a heap on the floor, her fingers fumbling. Every rustle of fabric sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness. She found him in the barn, his back to her, brushing down his horse with a fierce, rhythmic energy that was more about exorcising demons than grooming. He had to have heard her enter. The floorboards creaked, the air shifted, but he did not turn. He did not speak. He just kept brushing, his arm moving in a steady, punishing rhythm. "Thomas?" she ventured, her voice small in the vast, high-ceilinged space. The brushing stopped. He remained with his back to her for a long, agonizing moment before he finally turned. His face was a fortress. The soft, broken man from the night before was gone, replaced by the hard, unreadable rancher. His eyes were clear of whiskey, but clouded with something far more impenetrable, a deep, shuddered remorse that looked sickeningly like regret. There was no warmth in his gaze, no tenderness. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, a problem he had yet to solve. "The chores need to be done," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "Silas is waiting for you with the feed." It was a dismissal, a cold, clean severing. He was pretending it had never happened. The kiss, the desperate embrace, the shared vulnerability. He was erasing it all with the cold, hard reality of a new day and the duties it contained. A wave of humiliation, so hot and sharp it made her gasp, washed over Isabel. Her heart, which had dared to feel a fragile hope, felt as if it had been crushed in his fist. She had offered him her last shred of vulnerability, and he had looked at it in the morning light and thrown it away. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were a knot of broken glass in her throat. She turned and fled the barn, her cheeks burning. She did not go to Silas. She went to her small room in the tack shed. The heavy wool blanket he had given her was still folded neatly on the cot. The sight of it was a fresh torment, a gesture of care from a man who now looked at her with the cold eyes of a stranger. She pulled out her worn satchel and began to pack her few belongings. Her hands were shaking. She could not stay. She could not endure this. To see him every day, to work in his house, to live with the ghost of what had happened between them. A ghost he refused to even acknowledge. It would be a slow, living death. Humiliation was a bitter pill, but pride was all she had left. She would take it and go. Anywhere would be better than here. She was just fastening the strap on her satchel when the door to her room was thrown open. Thomas stood there, filling the doorway. He looked from her face to the bag in her hand, and for the first time that morning, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Panic. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Our contract is concluded." "No," he said, the word sharp. He took a step into the room, a violation of the space he himself had assigned her. "You can't leave. You have made it clear there is no place for me here. Mr. Miller." "That's not true. The ranch needs you. The work needs to be done." He was fumbling, his usual stoic composure cracking under the sight of her packed bag. The thought of her walking away, of the house returning to its suffocating silence, of the nights returning to their lonely, humming emptiness, was a reality he was suddenly, desperately unprepared to face. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't say that her presence had become a necessity, that her quiet competence had become the rhythm of his life, that the moment he had held her had been the first time he'd felt truly alive in 5 years. To say those things would be to betray his vow to Alara, to admit that the fortress around his heart had been breached. He was a coward, and so he fell back on the only language he felt was safe, the language of their original arrangement, commerce. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather purse. "I will not let you leave," he said, his voice regaining its authority. "Your work has been satisfactory, more than satisfactory. I will double your wages, effective immediately, double. That should be enough to satisfy any complaints you may have." Isabel stared at him, and then at the purse he was holding out to her. The blood drained from her face. It was the cruelest, most devastating thing he could have possibly done. He was paying her. He was reducing what had happened between them, that fragile, desperate, and profoundly human moment of connection, to a service, an extra duty for which the housekeeper would now be compensated. He was putting a price tag on her heart. The hurt was so immense, so deep. It transcended tears. It became a cold, dead weight in the pit of her stomach. She felt herself shrink, becoming nothing more than a commodity, an object to be bought and used. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the money in his face and walk away with her head held high. But the image of her sister's face, thin and worried, and the faces of her children, rose in her mind. Double the wages. It was a fortune. It was not just winter provisions. It was a chance for a new start, for a doctor for her sister's cough. It was a lifeline she did not have the right to refuse for the sake of her own wounded pride. Her hand, when she reached out to take the purse, was cold and steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was as empty as a winter sky. "As you wish, Mr. Miller," she said. "I will stay." She accepted, but in that moment, something precious between them broke, perhaps irrevocably. She was no longer a woman in his house. She was an item he had purchased. A week later, a sickness swept through Redemption Gap. It started with a fever and a cough, and within days, it had laid low a dozen families. The doctor, a weary, overworked man named Elias, set up a makeshift aid station in the back room of the church. He quickly ran out of healthy bodies to help. Fear was more contagious than the fever, and people shuttered themselves in their homes. When Isabel heard the news from a worried Silas, she did not hesitate. Here was a purpose. Here was a place where she could be useful, where her hands could do good, where she could escape the suffocating, silent prison the ranch had become. That afternoon, she walked into the aid station. The scene was grim. Cots lined the walls, filled with the sick and moaning. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, sickness, and carbolic. "Doctor." Elias looked up as she entered, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "I'm here to help," Isabel said simply. "I'm strong. I'm not afraid of the work." The doctor looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw not the scandalous woman of town gossip, but a calm, capable woman offering help when no one else would. A wave of relief washed over his face. "God bless you, child," he said. "Take that corner. They need water, and the soup on the stove needs stirring." Isabel found her rhythm in the quiet, desperate work of caring for the sick. She changed sweat-soaked sheets, spooned broth into parched mouths, bathed hot foreheads, and murmured soothing words to the delirious. She worked from noon until long after dark, pushing herself to the point of exhaustion. In the suffering of others, her own heartache seemed to recede, to become a smaller, more manageable thing. Here, she was not the rancher's paid woman. She was just Isabel, a pair of helping hands. Thomas was lost. Her absence from the ranch was a palpable void. The meals were once again bland and functional. The house felt hollow, its silence mocking him. He found himself wandering the rooms, his hand tracing the dust-free surfaces she had so recently cleaned. He told himself it was the disruption to his routine that unsettled him. It was a lie. He began to ride to the edge of town in the late afternoons, reining in his horse on a small rise that overlooked the church. He would watch from a distance, a solitary, tormented figure. He saw her moving past the windows, a silhouette of grace and purpose. He saw the doctor emerge and speak to her, placing a grateful hand on her shoulder. He saw the townspeople who brought supplies look at her with a new, dawning respect. She was earning a new reputation, one of her own making, through her quiet, selfless work. He was racked with a guilt so profound it felt like a physical illness. He had created the cage of her first reputation with his silence and his clumsy, violent defense. Now, as she was building a new life for herself outside of that cage, he remained a coward, watching from the shadows. He didn't have the courage to ride into town, to stand by her side, to lend his own strength to the effort. To do so would be a public declaration, an admission of a connection he was still too terrified to own. So he watched, and he hated himself for it. One afternoon, a fine carriage pulled up outside the church. A man stepped out, tall and well-dressed. It was Mr. Abernathy, a wealthy widower who owned the largest mercantile in the next county. Thomas watched as he spoke to Isabel at the doorway of the aid station. He saw the way Abernathy looked at her, with open admiration and respect. The next day, the news was all over town. Mr. Abernathy had made a formal offer of marriage to Isabel. He had spoken to the preacher, declaring his intentions to give the brave, hard-working woman from the aid station an honorable position as his wife. He wanted to rescue her from her precarious, nameless life. When Silas told him the news, Thomas felt the ground drop out from under him. The thought of Isabel belonging to another man, of her leaving the ranch for good, of her smile and her quiet presence being gifted to someone else, was a sudden, sharp, and unbearable pain. It was the pain of a man watching his most prized possession being given away, and he hated that he thought of her that way, but he could not help it. He waited for her to return that night, his gut twisted in knots. He was sure she would accept. How could she not? Abernathy was offering her everything Thomas would not: a name, respectability, security, a place in the world. When she finally came back to the ranch, she looked exhausted, her face pale in the moonlight. He met her by the barn. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. She looked at him, her eyes weary. "Is what true, Mr. Miller?" "Abernathy. He's asked you to marry him." "He has?" Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He waited for the confirmation, the final blow. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him no," she said quietly. Thomas stared at her, stunned into silence. He didn't understand. He couldn't comprehend why she would turn down such an offer. Why would she choose this life of servitude and shadows with him over a life of honor with a respectable man? He searched her face for an answer, but it was unreadable. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression filled with a deep, questioning sadness. It was as if she was waiting for him to say something, to give her a reason for her own decision, to offer her a competing vision of a future. But he had nothing to offer her but more silence, more confusion. The name Ilara was a brand on his heart, a vow he didn't know how to break. Unsure of her own heart, and receiving no clarity from him, she simply turned and walked to her room, leaving him standing alone in the darkness with a relief so profound it felt like pain, and a confusion that was even worse. The conflict began to tear him apart. He started having nightmares. They were vivid, terrible things. He would be in a fire, reaching for a hand, and he wouldn't know if it was Ilara's or Isabel's. He would be drowning, calling out a name, but the face that looked down at him from the surface would shift from one to the other, both looking at him with the same sorrowful, accusing eyes. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his own strangled cry echoing in the silent room, the names tangled on his tongue. Ilara was his past, his grief, his sacred vow. Isabel was his present, a living, breathing reality of want and need that he was terrified to acknowledge. His mind, in its desperate attempt to reconcile the two, was breaking. He began to withdraw completely. The nightmares made it impossible to look at Isabel without feeling a fresh wave of guilt and terror. He avoided her, speaking only when absolutely necessary, his words clipped and cold. He was a man haunted, and he was making the entire ranch his haunted house. For Isabel, this was the final, crushing blow. She had endured the town's scorn. She had accepted his humiliating offer of payment. She had refused a chance at a better life, clinging to a sliver of hope she couldn't even name. And now, he treated her as if she didn't exist. He looked through her. The silence was no longer tense. It was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. There was nothing left for her here. The hope had finally, completely, died. One night, after a long shift at the aid station, she made her decision. She packed her small satchel one last time. She had saved nearly all the money he had paid her. It was enough for her sister, and enough for a stagecoach ticket far away from Redemption Gap. She did not leave a note. Words had failed them at every turn. Instead, she took out a small, simple linen handkerchief she had been embroidering in her rare moments of rest. She had stitched a delicate pattern of wildflowers in the corner, columbine and Indian paintbrush, the only things that still bloomed in the dry heat. It was the only beautiful thing she had made since she'd arrived. She crept into the main house, a ghost moving through the sleeping halls. She went to his room and paused at the door, her heart aching. She pushed it open. He was asleep, his face etched with turmoil even in slumber, caught in the grip of his nightly demons. Quietly, she tiptoed to the bedside table and placed the handkerchief beside his pillow. It was a final, silent farewell, a small piece of her, left behind in the emptiness. Then, without a backward glance, she slipped out of the house, out of the ranch, and walked into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but a whisper of lavender and the scent of wildflowers on a linen square. He awoke to a silence that was absolute. It was not the familiar, grudging silence of his solitary life, but a new, hollowed-out emptiness that pressed in on him from all sides. He reached for the bedside table, and his fingers brushed against the soft, embroidered linen. The handkerchief, the only thing she had left behind. He lifted it, the scent of wildflowers, faint and ghostly, rising to meet him. It was proof she had been real. The ranch began to die. It was a slow, quiet decay, a mirror of the rot in his own soul. The order Isabel had brought to his world dissolved back into the chaos of neglect. A fine layer of dust, her sworn enemy, began to resettle on every surface. The meals became a joyless necessity of burned coffee and dry bread. The laundry piled up, untouched. The house, which had briefly held the semblance of a home, reverted to being a mere shelter, a place to hide from the elements, and it was a poor hiding place from the storm inside him. He was a ghost in his own life. He moved through the motions of his chores, but his heart wasn't in it. The cattle seemed to sense the despair, their lowing sounds more mournful. Silas watched him with worried eyes. His questions met with grunts and silence. Thomas would find himself standing in the middle of a room, the embroidered handkerchief in his hand, unable to remember what he was supposed to be doing. He had chased her away, seeking the return of his solitude, and now that he had it, he found it was not a peaceful sanctuary, but a barren, echoing prison. The silence he had once cultivated as a shield was now his punishment, and her humming was a phantom melody that haunted its every corner. He told himself it was for the best. She was a complication, a disruption to the sterile order of his grief. He had severed the connection, cauterized the wound, but it was a lie. He had not cut out a sickness. He had cut out his own heart, and he was bleeding out into the dust. A week after she left, Silas found him staring blankly at a broken fence post, a hammer hanging uselessly in his hand. "Thomas," the old foreman said. his voice gentle but firm. "You need to hear something." Thomas didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the splintered wood. "It's about Isabel," Silas pressed on. "Doctor, Elias was by the edge of town this morning, looking for supplies. He said she never left Redemption Gap." Thomas's head snapped up, his heart giving a painful lurch. A wild, foolish hope flared within him. She was still here. "She's been at the aid station this whole time," Silas continued, his expression grim. "Living there, working till she dropped. And she's come down with a fever. Thomas, a bad case of it. The doctor's worried. Says she wore herself down to nothing caring for everyone else." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The hammer fell from Thomas's numb fingers, thudding softly in the dirt. She was sick. She had gotten sick in the very place she had sought refuge and purpose. She had caught the fever while he had been hiding on his ranch, clutching a handkerchief and drowning in self-pity. The guilt was a physical blow, a fist in his gut that stole his breath. He didn't remember the ride to town. It was a blur of frantic, churning dust and the rhythmic pounding of his horse's hooves, a counterpoint to the frantic, panicked beating of his own heart. He reined his horse to a stop before the church, its white paint peeling in the merciless sun. The front doors were propped open, and from within came the low, murmuring sounds of suffering. He dismounted, his legs unsteady. He walked to the doorway, but he could go no further. He was paralyzed by a cowardice so profound it rooted him to the spot. What right did he have to enter? What could he say? He who had driven her away with his coldness, his silence, his final, cruel transaction. He who had watched from the hills while she worked herself to the bone. The shame was a thick, choking thing. He was a trespasser here, in this place of suffering and selfless care. He stood there for a long time, a statue of indecision and regret, half hidden in the shadows of the porch. He saw a doctor. Elias moved past the doorway, his face gray with exhaustion. He saw townswomen, their faces covered with cloths, hurrying in and out with buckets of water. And then he saw her. She was sitting on the edge of a low cot, just inside the doorway, her back to him. Her hair, usually in its severe, practical knot, was loose, falling in dark, tangled waves over her shoulders. Her movements were slow, her body language radiating a deep, consuming weariness. Even from behind, he could see the fever's toll. She was giving a small cup of water to a little girl, no older than 5, whose parents had both been taken by the fever last week. The little girl drank thirstily, then leaned her head against Isabel's side, her small arms wrapping around her waist. "Mama," the child whispered, her voice a small, trusting sound. "My head hurts." Isabel swayed slightly, her own strength clearly failing, but she managed to put a hand on the child's hair, stroking it gently. "I know, sweet Lily, I know. Just rest now." The word, Mama, struck Thomas with the force of a physical blow. It was a word of pure, uncomplicated love and trust. It was a name given not by contract or by law, but by the simple, honest instinct of a child who recognized a source of comfort, of safety, of love. In that moment, all the town's ugly gossip, all his own dark suspicions, all the complicated, painful walls he had built around her, they all crumbled into dust. He saw her not as a working bride, not as a temptation, not as a ghost of his past, but as this child saw her, as a woman with a boundless capacity for care. As he watched, Isabel was seized by a fit of coughing, a dry, racking sound that shook her thin frame. She slumped forward, the cup falling from her hand. The little girl, Lily, looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. The paralysis that had held Thomas broke. He didn't think. He simply moved. He strode through the doorway and into the back room of the church. He knelt down in front of them. Isabel looked up, her eyes wide with fever and surprise. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, her dark eyes glassy, but they were fixed on him. "You're here," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I'm here," he said, his own voice thick. The little girl, Lily, looked from Isabel to the large, grim-faced man who had appeared so suddenly. She shrank back, pressing closer to Isabel. "It's all right, Lily," Isabel murmured, trying to reassure her. She attempted to pat the girl's shoulder, but the effort seemed to drain the last of her strength. She sagged against the cot. Without a word, Thomas reached out. "Come here, little one," he said gently. He expected the girl to cry, to refuse, but she looked from his face to Isabel's, and seeing no fear there, she allowed him to lift her. He stood up, holding the child in his arms. She was so light, a fragile bundle of warmth and trust. She settled against his chest, her small head finding the crook of his neck, her breathing soft against his skin. It had been years since he had held anyone. The feeling was so foreign, so powerful. It was almost painful. It was the feeling of life, of family, of a connection that went deeper than words. For the first time since Alara had died, he felt the ghost of what a home was supposed to feel like. It was a warmth that spread through his chest, an antidote to the cold, creeping emptiness that had lived there for so long. He looked down at Isabel, who was watching them, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were clear for a moment, the fever haze receding, replaced by a deep, searching clarity. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation, no bitterness for his long silence. There was only a quiet, devastatingly simple question. "Are you still afraid of your heart, Thomas?" she whispered. The question hit him with the force of a revelation. She saw it all. She saw past his anger and his pride to the terrified man hiding beneath. She knew his fear was not of her, but of himself, of the feelings she evoked in him. He had no answer for her. He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He just held the child tighter and looked at the woman on the cot, the woman he had driven away, the woman who knew him better than he knew himself. That night, he did not go back to the ranch. He found one of the church women to look after Lillian, ignoring the curious stares and the doctor's weary protests. He took up a vigil by Isabel's bedside. He pulled a wooden chair close to her cot and sat. The aid station was quieter now, the worst of the night's suffering having settled into a low, exhausted murmur. A single lamp burned on a distant table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He watched her sleep. In the dim light, he could see the faint, bluish shadows under her eyes, the stark vulnerability of her face now that her waking guard was down. She was thinner than he remembered. He reached out a hand, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently, tentatively, brushing a stray lock of damp hair from her forehead. Her skin was burning hot. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection that shot through his arm and settled deep in his chest. He did not pull his hand away. He let it rest there, in her hair, his thumb stroking her temple in a slow, soothing rhythm. He sat like that for hours, a silent, unmoving guardian. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart were gone, washed away by the tide of his fear for her, all his pride, his anger, his stubborn grief. It all seemed like a foolish indulgence in the face of this fragile, sleeping woman. He had been so afraid of betraying Alara's memory that he had failed to see the living, breathing miracle in front of him. He had been honoring a ghost while slowly killing the only thing that had made him feel alive again. Sometime after midnight, she began to toss and turn, caught in the grip of the fever. She murmured things he couldn't understand, her hands plucking at the thin blanket. He leaned closer, taking one of her hands in his. It was hot and dry. He held it, hoping his presence could somehow anchor her, could pull her back from the fevered depths. Her eyes flickered open, but they were unseeing, lost in the delirium. "Thomas?" she whispered, her gaze fixed on something far away. "Thomas, are you there?" "I'm here, Isabel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He squeezed her hand. "I'm right here." A small, sad smile touched her lips. She seemed to relax slightly at the sound of his voice. "So cold," she murmured. "In the shed. You brought the blanket." She sighed, a soft, weary sound. "You don't have to save me, you know? I don't need to be saved." Her fingers tightened on his. Her next words were so quiet, so filled with a deep, heartbreaking longing, that he had to lean in to hear them. "I just need to be kept." The words shattered the last of his defenses. "I don't need to be saved. Just kept." It wasn't a plea for rescue, not a request for a white knight like Abernathy. It was a plea for something far more simple and profound. To be held on to be chosen, to not be let go. It was a plea for the one thing he had been too afraid to give. A sound tore from his throat, a choked, ragged sob that was half grief and half relief. The carefully constructed dam he had built around his emotions 5 years ago broke, and everything poured out. He lowered his head until his forehead was resting on their joined hands. And he wept. He wept for Ilara, for the love he had lost in the long, empty years that had followed. He wept for Isabel, for the pain and humiliation he had caused her. And he wept for himself, for his own blind, stubborn cowardice. They were the first tears he had shed since the day he had lowered his wife into the cold, hard ground. They were tears of loss, but they were also tears of discovery. He cried until he was empty, until the only thing left was the feeling of her small, hot hand in his. He lifted his head, his face wet, and looked at her sleeping face. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not lose her. He had let one woman he loved slip away from him. He would not make the same mistake again. He held her hand tighter, a silent, desperate prayer, a new vow made in the heart of the feverish night. He would keep her. The fever broke like a storm. One moment, Isabel was lost in a burning, endless desert. The next, she was awake, floating in a sea of cool, blessed stillness. The first thing she saw was his face. Thomas. He was asleep in a chair beside her cot, his head slumped forward, his face etched with an exhaustion that seemed to go clear to the bone. His hand was holding hers, his grip loose in sleep but still present, an anchor in the shifting tides of her consciousness. Her recovery was a slow, tentative dawn. For days, she was too weak to do more than sip the broth he patiently spooned into her mouth and listen to the quiet sounds of the aid station. Thomas was a constant, silent presence. He rarely spoke, but he was always there. He would change the cool compress on her forehead, adjust her blankets, or simply sit, watching her breathe as if it were the most important event in the world. He had taken over the care of little Lily, and Isabel would watch them from her cot, a strange, painful ache in her chest. She saw the way he lifted the child onto his shoulders, the way he answered her endless questions with a gruff, newfound patience. He was a natural father, a natural husband, a man built for a family he had denied himself. The town, which had once scorned her, now treated her with a quiet reverence. The women who came to the aid station would bring her small gifts, a jar of preserves, a freshly baked loaf of bread. They called her a hero. They didn't know that she felt like a fraud, a woman who had run to the aid of others only because she was running from the ruin of her own heart. As her strength returned, so did her clarity, his vigil, his gentle care, his fierce, protective presence. They were real. But she had seen this before. She had seen the crack in his armor, the man beneath the grief, only to have him seal it up again in the cold light of day. What was different now? He had held her hand through a fever, but what would happen when she was well? When she was no longer a patient in need of care, but a woman, a complication, a daily reminder of the line he had crossed. She could not live like that. She could not spend her life waiting for the other shoe to drop, wondering which version of him she would face each morning, the tender guardian of the night, or the cold, remote rancher of the day. She had tasted respectability in the town's changed attitude. She had felt a sense of purpose in her work. She could not go back to being a shadow in his house, a paid-for secret. She needed to be more than a memory's replacement or a moment's weakness. She needed a life that was her own. Spring arrived, breathing life back into the weary land. The creek at the ranch began to run clear and full. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the cracked earth, and the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods began to haze with the promise of new leaves. It was a season of new beginnings, and Isabel knew it was time for hers. She waited until she was strong enough to walk the mile back to the ranch without tiring. Thomas had brought her things to the small room behind the church, but she needed to face him on his own land. He met her on the porch, his face a mixture of relief and a deep, guarded apprehension. "You're well," he said. It wasn't a question.
"I am,"
she replied, her voice steady.
"Thanks to you and Dr. Elias."
He led her into the kitchen. It was spotlessly clean. He had been keeping up with her work. A small pot of wildflowers sat in a jar on the table, the same flowers from her embroidered handkerchief.
"I came to tell you I'll be leaving,"
she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The stagecoach comes through on Friday. I have enough money for my ticket, and enough to send to my sister." He froze, his hand halfway to the coffee pot. He turned to face her slowly, and she saw a raw, undisguised panic in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had when he'd found her packing her bag months ago. "Leaving?" he repeated, the word sounding hollow.
"Where would you go? Your place is here."
"What place is that, Thomas?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "Am I your housekeeper? A patient you feel responsible for? Am I the woman you pay double wages to for services rendered?" The words tasted like poison, but they had to be said. "I cannot live in the space between those things. I will not. I have a chance now to make a real life for myself. People in this town respect me. I can find honest work. I can have a name that is my own." He stood there, mute, his face a mask of turmoil. He looked like a man watching his house burn down, knowing he was the one who had struck the match. She saw the battle raging in his eyes, the fight between his fear and his heart. She had to turn away, because if she looked at him for a second longer, her resolve would crumble.
"I'll collect my things from the church,"
she said, her voice catching slightly. "Goodbye, Thomas." She walked out of the house, out into the bright, hopeful spring sunshine, and did not look back. Each step was an agony, a tearing away from the only place that had ever begun to feel like a home. She was halfway across the main yard when she heard the thunder of hooves behind her. He did not ride up beside her. He rode past her, reining his horse to a skidding stop in the middle of the wide, empty pasture that separated the ranch from the road to town. He just sat there, on his horse, his back to the ranch, his face toward the open country. He was a silhouette against the vast blue sky. She stopped walking, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited. He didn't speak. He didn't reason or argue or command. He just sat there, a silent, unmoving obstacle in her path. She could walk around him. The pasture was wide, but she knew this was not a physical barrier. It was something else. Finally, when the silence had stretched so long, it had become a living thing between them. He did the one thing she did not expect. He threw his head back, and from deep in his chest, a sound tore out, raw and full of 5 years of pain and a season of desperate, terrified love. It was not a speech. It was not a plea. It was just her name.
"Isabel!"
The name echoed across the field, carried on the spring breeze. It was not a command. It was a cry. The sound of a man calling out for the one thing he could not bear to lose. It was the sound of a heart breaking and healing all at the same time. She stood frozen, the sound washing over her. All the logic, all the pride, all the carefully constructed reasons for leaving, they meant nothing in the face of that single, desperate word. Slowly, she turned to face him. He had dismounted and was standing in the middle of the field, waiting. She walked toward him, the new green grass soft beneath her feet. When she was standing before him, she looked into his eyes. The fear was gone. The ghosts were gone. All she saw was a man, stripped bare of his defenses, his heart open and waiting.
"Thomas," she said, her voice a whisper. "What am I to you? Am I to be a bride sent to you for work, or am I something else?"
He reached out and took her hands in his. His were warm and strong, and they held hers as if he would never let go. "When Ilara died," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I made a vow to a ghost. I promised my heart to a memory. I was wrong. My heart is not a stone to be placed on a grave. It's for the living." He looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "I don't know what to call you. Isabel, the words, they don't fit. Wife and bride are for tradition, for contracts. You are more than that. You are the woman who taught a dead man how to feel again. You are the one who makes the silence bearable. You are the one I'm not letting go of. No matter what tradition, or this town, or the ghosts of the past have to say about it." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. She had asked for a definition, a label. He had given her a vow. They were married a week later, not in the church with its judgmental pews, but right there, in that same pasture. Spring had exploded into full bloom, and the field was a carpet of Indian paintbrush and bluebells. There was no preacher, no white dress, no crowd of onlookers. Their only witnesses were Silas, his eyes suspiciously moist, and little Lily, who held a fistful of wildflowers and looked on with a child's solemn understanding. Isabel wore her best simple dress, and Thomas wore a clean shirt. They stood under the vast, open sky, the same sky that had once seemed so merciless and was now a brilliant, hopeful blue. They did not exchange rings. They exchanged promises. "I will not hide you," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I will not hide from you. My heart, my home, my name, they are yours. I will keep you." "And I will keep you," she whispered back, her hand in his, "from the silence and from the ghosts." The town of Redemption Gap, of course, buzzed with gossip. The rancher Miller, marrying his scandalous housekeeper in a field, with no preacher to sanctify it. They predicted it would end in ruin, a disgrace, but they were wrong. What the town saw in the months that followed was not a scandal, but a quiet, unshakable partnership. They saw the way Thomas looked at his wife, a look of open adoration that softened the hard lines of his face. They saw the laughter that returned to the Miller ranch, carried on the wind. They saw the three of them, Thomas, Isabel, and little Lily, whom they adopted as their own, ride into town on the wagon, a picture of a family so content, so complete, that it silenced the most vicious of whispers. People began to see not a fallen man and a fallen woman, but two strong, decent people who had found a home in each other, against all odds. Acceptance came slowly, grudgingly at first, and then, all at once, as the town came to understand that some bonds are forged in fires that tradition cannot comprehend. Years later, the ranch was thriving. The house was filled with the sounds of two more children, their laughter mingling with Lily's. One warm summer evening, Thomas was sitting on the porch swing, the one that had been still for so long, with Lily, now a girl of 10, curled up beside him. "Papa?" she asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Tell me again. Tell me the story of how you met Mama." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes, crinkling the corners where the deep lines of grief had once been. He looked out across the green, prosperous land, and he saw his wife coming up from the garden, her basket full, her face glowing in the golden light of the setting sun. His heart was so full, it felt like it might burst. He pulled his daughter a little closer and began the story, his voice a low, warm rumble, filled with a love that had been tested and proven true. "It was the hottest day of a long, terrible drought," he said, his eyes twinkling. "A stagecoach pulled into town, covered in dust. and the most beautiful woman I had ever seen stepped out into the sun. She looked right at me, and do you know what the very first words she ever said to me were? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She said, "Let's make it quick tonight." He paused, and a soft, genuine laugh escaped him. The sound of a man remembering the precise, miraculous moment he had been truly saved. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in. If you enjoyed the tale of Thomas and Isabel, we invite you to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories from the frontier. And please, share your thoughts. We read every one.